Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. As Nadia says, my name is Simon Ruffle and I'm a psychiatrist based in South London. I also do research into psychedelics, kings, namely ayahuasca. And today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what we've been doing over the last few years, which is looking into ayahuasca in an adapted traditional setting in the Peruvian Amazon. So that is retreat centres. I'd just like to mention the rest of the team as well. So alongside myself, there's Nige Netzband and Waifeng Sang, who are two psychologists, and we all do the research together. So today we're going to be quickly discussing ayahuasca and associated tourism. Then we're going to move on to our first pilot study, looking at effects of ayahuasca on personality. We're then going to have a look at our latest study, which is looking at ayahuasca and childhood trauma and associated mental health outcomes. I'd also like to emphasize that we're not coming here today as experts. We're still very much learning based on the research of other people, such as Bia, and of course, the indigenous populations. So what is ayahuasca? This is actually a really complex question that we can't really answer in one slide, nor could we answer it probably in 100 slides. Ayahuasca can be many different things to many different people. Very simply put, ayahuasca is a psychedelic plant brew. So it's a liquid that you drink, and it's made up of two main components. You have the ayahuasca vine, which is Banisteriopsis caapi, and you have leaves. More recently, these leaves are normally Psychotria viridis, and the leaves contain dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a very potent psychedelic. Normally, if you were to contain DMT in this way orally, it would get broken down by enzymes in the stomach. And it's the beta-carbolines that are in the ayahuasca vine that prevent this from being broken down and allow the DMT to be absorbed into the bloodstream, which then passes to the brain and you get the psychedelic effects. So for most people, there are profound changes in their sensory perception. And this can also include changes in their cognition and their thinking and their emotion. A lot of people purge, and that can be vomiting or that can be diarrhea. For some people, it might even be emotion, so lots of crying, maybe even laughing. Many people experience visions. Some people have a deep introspective experience. They go inside themselves and their thought processes change. And for many, they believe that they actually connect to the divine, to God. Ayahuasca is used as a medicine and a sacrament. It's used as a tool. It's used for spiritual development, for scientific inquiry. More historically, it's used, and more traditionally, it's used in warfare and also in hunting. And more recently, it's become something that has attracted tourists and pilgrimage. So I don't think it would be right to talk about research in retreat centres without briefly discussing ayahuasca tourism. There's been a huge increase in the amount of people drinking ayahuasca over the last 10 or 20 years. And that's people going to the Amazon rainforests in order to drink ayahuasca. And also people, and also ayahuasca spreading out of the rainforest into the the global north. Some people think that this is actually diluting tradition. Westerners quite often have an idea of what they think that ayahuasca should be about. And some of the retreat centres are tailoring their retreats and the experiences to match that. There are also concerns that there might be issues with the environment. This is to do with ayahuasca being harvested and whether that's being done sustainably, and also the increasing numbers of people flying over to the Amazon rainforest. There are some issues to do with safety. Ayahuasca is largely unregulated, and this has led to charlatans, people who don't have the appropriate training and don't have the appropriate qualifications in order to conduct ceremonies. People may therefore be more susceptible to psychological trauma, maybe even physical trauma. Unfortunately, it's not completely uncommon to hear about sexual exploitation in ayahuasca ceremonies, and also financial exploitation. Shakruna.net has actually released some guidelines for awareness of sexual abuse in ayahuasca ceremonies. And these are specifically targeted towards women, especially lone women. And there's also an ethical code that's been released in order to help guide the way the ceremonies should be run. Some people have raised concerns that ayahuasca might become a commodification, that the locals might be disadvantaged due to cultural appropriation, that this might be another example of neo-colonialism, a market that's controlled mainly by non-locals, by non-indigenous. With the large amounts of money that come in as a result of ayahuasca tourism to these communities, some communities may well be destabilized. But that being said, when it's done well, ayahuasca retreat centers and the use of ayahuasca can lead to healing, meaning, and community. And some have argued they might even help to promote and protect traditions that would otherwise potentially become lost in time. So moving on to our first study, we were looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. The reason that we wanted to conduct this study was to add to the growing body of knowledge surrounding psychedelics, obviously specifically ayahuasca. Previous research had demonstrated changes in personality with psilocybins, that's in magic mushrooms, and also LSD acid. We wanted to see whether there was any potential direction for clinical applications. So for example, if we saw decreases in how neurotic people were due to ayahuasca, could that help in conditions such as anxiety? We wanted to focus on set and setting using traditional elements, working with shamans and curanderos in the Amazon rainforest. And also ayahuasca is legal in Peru, so it made it easier for us to conduct the research there. So the setting that we followed was an adapted Shipibo framework. Shipibo are the group of people who are using ayahuasca, who we work with. We're working with experienced practitioners such as Don Rono, who we can see in this slide. He's one of the curanderos or the shamans. And the retreat and research center is based in the Mashana National Reserve. This is a community of 80 indigenous people. There's no mains electricity, no phone signal, and no internet. And it's 2 hours away from the nearest town, which is Iquitos. The research center is called RIOSBO, and it's affiliated with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as I'm sure most of you have heard of. So here we can see where the retreat center is located in the Amazon rainforest in Peru. We hypothesized that we would see increases in openness and how open people feel after drinking ayahuasca. And we also hypothesized that this would be maintained in the long term, so 6 months after drinking ayahuasca. We also thought that the more intense the mystical or peak experience, and this is where the participants perceive themselves to be outside of time, connected to God, connected to nature, the more pronounced we would see changes in their personality. We also thought that subjects with affective disorders like depression or anxiety may well have more significant decreases in neuroticism. We used an observational repeated measures design. So we handed out inventories immediately before the first ayahuasca ceremony and immediately following the final ayahuasca ceremony. Participants drank ayahuasca every other day for 2 weeks, and so that was 6 ceremonies in total. And then we also collected data 6 months after the final ceremony to look for long-term changes. We conducted semi-structured interviews to get qualitative information, and this provides more of a holistic idea of the mechanisms behind the changes from a psychological point of view. And this has been published in a separate publication. Here's another image of the Mashana community where we do the research. And this is actually RIOSBO Research Center. So in this study, we had 24 participants, 9 of which were female. They were primarily Western, and they were vetted by the Retreat Center, which is the Ayahuasca Foundation. 12 had either ongoing or historical psychiatric conditions, and 14 had problems with their physical health. 4 didn't have any physical or psychiatric conditions. 6 people had never tried psychedelics before. 10 had, and 8 had experience with ayahuasca. We also had a control group of people who weren't drinking ayahuasca. These were people who were just in youth hostels, and we got this control group to try and control for something that we've called the Mallorca effect. So the idea that even getting yourself to South America when you're not drinking ayahuasca might have some kind of an impact on personality and anxiety and things like that. We use the NEO-PI to assess personality. And this is an inventory that measures personality in 5 different domains, and these are called the big 5. There's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And we use the mystical experience questionnaire to assess the peak experiences, so that's a connection to the divine, being outside of time, connected to nature, and things like that. We found that participants had significant decreases in how neurotic they were immediately after the ayahuasca retreats. And these were maintained 6 months later, whilst compared to the control group. And we also found that participants had significant increases in how agreeable they were. And this was in the short term and also in the long term as well. What's more, we found that the stronger the mystical experience, so connected to God, the greater the decrease in how neurotic participants felt afterwards and at 6 months later. So we believe that these reductions in neuroticism suggest potential therapeutic applications for conditions such as anxiety. And this is in line with previous research, such as David Arizzo's work with depression and psilocybin at Imperial. It's not in line with other research, such as McLean, who found that there were increases in openness as a result of taking psilocybin. But that may well be because it takes a certain kind of person to go to the Amazon rainforest and to go to a retreat center to drink ayahuasca. They're probably fairly open already. And so maybe that's why we didn't pick up significant changes there. It's also difficult to determine what's due to ayahuasca and what is due to the setting, to the ceremony, to the maloka, which is the temple where people drink ayahuasca in the retreats. A few limitations from this research. So we had limited access to equipment because we were in the Amazon rainforest. There were also no set doses of ayahuasca. So it was up to the shaman, curandero, to decide how much ayahuasca each participant drank. Some might see this as a limitation, but seeing it was an observational study, that could be a strength because it wouldn't go in line with the tradition to measure specifically how much ayahuasca people were drinking. Unfortunately, in this study, we weren't able to analyze the ayahuasca samples to look at the quantity of DMT and MOAIs, although that is something that we're doing in our latest research, which we'll get onto. There's a clear self-selection bias as well. It takes a particular kind of person to get themselves to a retreat center. And that's not just character type. That can also be due to financial income, whether you can get time off work, whether you can leave your family, if you have a family, to go to the jungle. Our sample size was quite small, and also in the 6-month follow-up, some of the participants had started doing things that might affect the results, for example, started yoga or meditation. Okay. So now moving on to our latest research. So we've started looking at the impact of ayahuasca on trauma-related conditions in the same setting. I just want to say a big thank you to Celia Morgan for supervising us on this one, and also to the Medical Research Council for funding this. So we wanted to look at the short and long-term impact of mental health outcomes in comparison to different degrees of childhood trauma. And we also wanted to see to what extent overgeneralized autobiographical memories, as well as mystical experiences, mediated these changes. Memories are thought to become more overgeneralized when you're depressed. So we had 65 participants in this study. We collected quantitative data in a similar structure to our previous study, although we had a lot more inventories in this one. Also collected semi-structured interviews to look for qualitative data. In this study as well, we collected saliva samples immediately before and after the retreats. And this is to look at something called epigenetics, which is the way that the DNA is expressed as a result of drinking ayahuasca. So we found that participants became significantly less depressed, both in the short term and the long term at 6-month follow-up. Similarly, there were decreases in how anxious the participants were, both in the short and the long term. Participants' self-compassion increased, so this is self-kindness and self-judgment, and this was in the short term and again in the long term. And the global distress significantly decreased, again, both short and long term. We found that the way that participants perceived negative things that had happened to them in the past changed, and that they looked at them with a more positive light. We didn't find any correlation between our results and the degree of mystical experience that participants underwent. And this didn't match with our previous research. We were also quite surprised to find that there wasn't any correlation between the degree of childhood trauma that participants had experienced and their mental health outcomes. This is maybe because the childhood questionnaire, the childhood trauma questionnaire that we used, looks at quite severe trauma. So it's things like physical or sexual abuse in childhood. And because we were using a non-clinical sample, a lot of our participants thankfully hadn't experienced things like that. In terms of genetics, we found that one particular gene, the sigma-1 gene, had an increase in methylation. And this gene is associated with trauma and also associated with neuroplasticity, so the ability of the neurons in the brain to make new connections. I should, however, stress that 65 is a very small sample for epigenetic analysis, so we can't draw any conclusions from this data, but it does suggest that further research should be done in the area. So a quick note about the research that we have coming up. We're actually starting data collection now. Nigel's in the rainforest as we speak, setting up our latest study, where we're looking at continued and repeated trauma rather than these big severe traumas such as sexual abuse. We're also looking at changes in perception of that trauma as well as a result of ayahuasca. We're working towards starting to look at giving ayahuasca to veterans with PTSD, working alongside a charity called Heroic Hearts. And we want to continue collecting saliva samples for more epigenetic analysis. That's a really, really exciting area. And we're also just waiting to hear back from the lab to see exactly the quantities of DMT and MRIs that were in the ayahuasca samples. And that will give us an idea of a clear result of the results that we're getting. Okay, so just as we begin to round up, I want to ask this question. I think it's good to keep checking ourselves, as we do this research. Is research into ayahuasca ethical? We can't deny that more and more people are drinking ayahuasca, both in the Amazon rainforest and all around the world, and therefore data is required to see what's happening to these people. There's been stagnation in treatments in psychiatry. Basically, since the turn of the millennium, there's been very little new treatments that have come out, and the new ones that have are normally different versions of older ones that we have. Could it be that ayahuasca provides some kind of inspiration into new ways of treating mental health problems? However, there are risks of medicalization. I think most people would agree that they wouldn't want to see ayahuasca in the hands of big pharma. There are loads of anecdotal media claims of both healing and harming. If you type ayahuasca into Google, these will all come up, and it's good to have some understanding of whether there's any truth behind these claims. Could this just be another case of cultural and spiritual appropriation? Is it that more and more people in the global north are having existential crises, and the Westerners have taken indigenous people's land and resources, and now we're moving on to the immaterial, to the spiritual resources? There are also issues with trying to view the outcomes of ayahuasca through a Western lens. There's danger of us oversimplifying the processes that are going on when we do this. And I'd also like to quickly mention reciprocity, which is giving back. The most obvious way of giving back is with money, but there are issues to do with this as well, such as destabilizing local communities and whether or not money is a fair exchange for spiritual knowledge. And there are a number of websites that I've listed on the bottom here who are running programs to try and help with reciprocity. For example, RAIN, which is one of the ones that we give to, does regenerative agroforestry with indigenous communities. This research is following continuing trends that we're seeing in science at the moment. This movement's been labeled the psychedelic renaissance, and there's definitely a massive increase in people being interested in psychedelic substances. We're also continuing to see the integration of different traditions from around the world into Western culture, for example, yoga. And it's not without its problems. Some people have labeled the recent uptake of mindfulness as muck mindfulness. There's been a shift in attitudes towards organic medicines. We can see that in areas such as Oakland and Colorado, which have recently decriminalized plant medicine. I think that there's also a danger of thinking that psychedelics and ayahuasca is a magic bullet for psychiatry. I just want to stress, I don't think there is a magic bullet, but I do think that ayahuasca, as Bea says, is much more than just an antidepressant. Great. So thanks very much for listening. And yeah, please feel free to ask any questions, or by all means, drop me an email if you want to talk further. Thanks a lot.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Simon. I think Anna's going to hop on as well, but we've had lots of great questions in the chat. So I'll just start off by asking, so you mentioned your control groups. And we've had a couple of questions regarding this and what exactly you meant by that. Was it that people sort of just went to South America, or did they actually attend the retreat and just sort of sit by? And do you think that if they did just sit there, do you think that there was a sort of placebo effect of them just being there? Did you witness any of that?
Sure. I mean, it would have been ideal to get a retreat full of people who weren't drinking ayahuasca, but were just on the retreat. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to do that. What we did is we went around to various youth hostels and got people who were backpacking to fill out the same inventories. The reason that we didn't do that in the second study is because it was such a pain to do. It was actually harder to do that than actually doing the study to begin with. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to have people on the retreats not drinking ayahuasca, and I do think that we probably would see some positive impact even if they're not drinking ayahuasca. There's something to be said about being in the Amazon rainforest, being completely unplugged. And it would be particularly interesting to see if ceremonies were run with the curanderos drinking ayahuasca and doing their work, and participants not drinking ayahuasca, what the outcomes were then. I mean, there are some people in the past where participants didn't even used to drink ayahuasca traditionally. So that would be really interesting to see if the curanderos were just doing their energetic work and what results we got there.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty interesting to see if you did almost have a placebo effect just by being present, and if people would be influenced just by the environment by itself. That'd be really fascinating to see. Another question we've had, so you mentioned in, I think, the first study that you were talking about that one of the results was that people became more agreeable in the long and short term, and you had other sort of measures like this and using those kind of words. How do you measure something like agreeability or their outlook? What sort of measures do you use? Can you go into detail of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the way that we measure them is using an inventory, so basically a questionnaire, a massive questionnaire called the NEO-PI, which is the gold standard for assessing personality. And what it does is it gives you 240 questions, kind of phrases of how you would react in certain situations. So, for example, when I walk into a crowded room, I feel everyone is looking at me, and you have to rank it on a Likert scale, so from 1 to 5, and then that assesses how neurotic you are, and each question is related to a different aspect of personality. So yeah, I agree. I mean, how do you measure personality? It's super difficult. It's really, it's really, really tough. But that's the gold standard. That's how people do it in research, is using this inventory. Normally, there are some other inventories too, but it's normally this one.
Yeah, I think it's quite hard to almost quantify things like agreeability and perceptions of self and things like that. But I guess that's what those sort of questionnaires are used for. And I don't know, perhaps something even better might come of all this research, maybe an even more robust kind of framework for it as we start to understand consciousness and those things more so.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, another question just regarding details of your studies. So you mentioned that I think it was about 6 months follow-up. Do you have any plans to follow up further than 6 months in your current studies or in future ones?
Yeah, I mean, we did try and do that. So the first study that we did, it was when we were first starting off, and nobody wanted to fund us, which I wasn't particularly surprised about. So we weren't paying participants, we weren't doing anything. We basically, just tried to get people to do it out of the kindness of their heart. And most people got back to us at 6 months, which was amazing. And we knew them pretty well from being on the retreats with them. But when we asked people to do yet another follow-up 1 year later, no one really replied. So that's why we stuck to the 6 month follow-up. If we manage to get more funding, and then we'd love to pay participants in order to encourage them to keep follow-up going for as long as possible. But I think, seeing as we haven't paid participants, there's a limit as to how much we can ask them to do. It's amazing that they're doing all of this anyway. So yeah.
I guess like if the larger your sample size, the more likely you are to have people actually agree to be followed up for longer. So yeah. I guess as the field increases and sample sizes increase and we have larger studies and whatnot, I think it will perhaps, hopefully in the future, we'll have even longer follow-up and more robust data to support all this. Right, another question we had, so you talked a lot about the positive impacts of ayahuasca and all the positive things that it does for you and in your agreeability and your outlook on life and view of self and perceiving past trauma. Did you find any negative impacts on personality from ayahuasca, both either on the individual or society, just in general?
That's a really interesting question, actually. I think it's quite easy to say, like, oh, decrease in neuroticism, like that's a positive thing. Is it? I guess so for most people, but you could argue, do we not need a degree of neuroticism? Is it not that degree of neuroticism that makes you study for your 4th year medical exams? Is it not that makes you run to the bus? If you don't have any neuroticism, then are we going to be losing something, some part of human personality? That aside, I think that we didn't see any negative outcomes. In our second study, there were a couple of people who became more depressed and more anxious 6 months later. But again, it's really difficult to see whether or not that's due to ayahuasca, because there could have been lots of other stuff going on. Also, I know that for some people might argue that when if you use psychedelics, you can dislodge things in your brain and bring them up to the surface, which then you work through. So it may well be that if we did a 1 year follow-up or your 2 year follow-up, that maybe they would have worked through that stuff that came up as a result of psychedelics. I think that the main risks are to do with things like psychosis and personality disorders. And so in our research, the retreat center screens out anyone that they think could be at risk of psychosis. So for example, if you have a family history or a past history, things like that. That being said, I want to also say that's looking at it through a very Western lens. Saying that psychosis is something that we can induce. And I have come across curanderos who have treated what we would call psychosis with ayahuasca, but that's kind of getting out of the realms of this talk, and I definitely wouldn't recommend anyone with psychosis to use ayahuasca at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's all really interesting. It's hard to sort of, I guess, understand all these things when they're so abstract as well. And going on from what you were saying about using ayahuasca to treat psychosis, I think when LSD was first discovered, they were using it as a model for schizophrenia, using it to understand how the schizophrenic brain works. And
Psychomimetic.
yeah, exactly. I think I think, as you said in your own talk, like, it can't be stressed enough that these substances aren't things to just sort of be played with. Setting are so important within it all. All right, so next question I've got here is, so you put up those 2 pictures of the research centre, and the environment looked absolutely beautiful. It was really green, really natural. It seemed mystical just looking at it. Do you think that that specific environment had an impact on the trip, and do you think that there was a way to measure, maybe a way to measure the effect of this?
For sure, that's actually a study that we're doing data collection for at the moment, looking at nature connectedness. I think that drinking ayahuasca in the Peruvian Amazon is that the environment's going to have a huge impact, and I think a lot of it comes down to what's your perception of ayahuasca, how do you define ayahuasca, and again, it's quite a Western way of looking at it, saying, oh, it's this brew of these plants. But is it? It could be, the whole ceremony. It could be, you could define ayahuasca as a ceremony in a maloca, in the Amazon rainforest, the whole experience. And so I think it's really difficult, and we probably shouldn't be trying to separate the different parts out. That being said, there's lots of interesting work going on to ayahuasca in labs at the moment. But I think you definitely would potentially lose something if you take it away from its environment. And that could either be the Peruvian Amazon, or it could be some of the ayahuasca churches that combine Christianity with ayahuasca throughout Brazil.
Yeah, I think the whole part of ayahuasca, it's like what you just said, that it's not just drinking ayahuasca and just sitting there and having your trip, it's the entire ceremony. I don't know if you could go into a little bit more detail about how an ayahuasca ceremony works, and sort of what actually goes on during that.
Sure. I mean, I can, in relation to this research, I can describe how the ceremonies and the retreats work. So there's the curandero, the shaman, who drinks ayahuasca with the participants, and they're in a structure called a maloca, which is like the space that you drink ayahuasca, which is actually that's something that's been made for ayahuasca tourists. So that traditionally it would be in a clearing in the forest rather than in the maloca, but in the retreat centers, that's how they do it. And then the curandero would wait for the effects of the ayahuasca to start taking effect, and they would start channeling energy in order to connect with spirits, what they perceive to be the spirits in the spirit world. And they do this largely through chants called icaros, which are shamanic songs that they use to make these connections with. And then they focus on each of the participants and would see how they can heal these participants. And that might be in the ceremony through channeling these energies to the participants to help them, or it might be receiving some information of plants that the participants need to drink outside of the ceremonies in order to cure a wide variety of different ailments. And the ceremonies would last for about 6 hours, and normally in the retreats you do one every day for anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. But again, even describing that's so different from when you look at the papers that we have, where we have these measures looking at personality or depression, and we make reference to the way that the indigenous, the Shipibo, believe that ayahuasca is working. So I just need to stress that in our papers, when we're talking about DMT being a serotonin 2A agonist, whatever that induces neuroplasticity, this is just another lens for what might be going on.
Yeah, I think all the culture surrounding it can't be forgotten. I mean, this is, something really, really sacred that has been around for a very long time, longer than the West has known. And I mean, it's pretty new for all of us, but for a lot of people from that culture, it's part of their history. I know you've got some questions.
That's not entirely. We're not sure how old it is, which is another thing. I think there's this Western perception that ayahuasca is this kind of ancient thing that's been around for thousands of years, and it's all about love. And I think that, you know, in reality, we know that ayahuasca has been around for at least 300. You know, it's probably been used in some kind of a form. DMT's been used, you know, much longer than that for sure. But it's been around for about, you know, in this form, about 300 years that we know of. And it was originally used for like warfare and hunting, as well as, you know, as well as healing people. And again, so I think this is very much the Westerners' idea of what ayahuasca is, this ancient thing based around love. And yeah, that is true to a certain degree, but it's also, you know, it's also kind of relatively modern and used for some stuff that maybe might make us feel a bit uncomfortable. And that's important to be aware of as well.
I think this is a great point to jump in. There's been some questions about sort of DMT versus ayahuasca. And I suppose one of the broader things around this topic is obviously we've got a huge unmet clinical need for psychedelics and for ayahuasca and things. And obviously we probably couldn't send everyone from a single GP practice to these clinics. So how do we, I suppose, translate that into something we could use here? And, you know, are we stealing, or should we be making DMT? And then it's all the questions about how important the ritual is and things. I mean, I'm sorry, that's a huge nugget. I'm just sort of synthesizing some questions I've seen. So tell me everything about, you know, the cultural identity of ayahuasca and how we could use DMT instead. But, yeah, take that as you will.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I don't know. My perception on it is that whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, you know, ayahuasca is spreading. You know, ayahuasca is spreading. It's pretty much in every, you know, all around the world now, and people are going out to the rainforest. And so I don't think it's. You could ask, is it right for it to spread? Either way, it is spreading. And so I think the question becomes, how can we do this in a responsible and respectful way? There was a conference in 2016 in Rio Branco in the Amazonian part of Brazil, an international ayahuasca conference. And people all around the world came, and there was a large indigenous turnout, and they were basically just saying, you have to include us in the spread of ayahuasca. This is, you know, this isn't just yours. And I think that when it spreads, when there are decisions to do with that, the indigenous have to be included. And it comes back to reciprocity, giving back, you know, credit where credit is due, and that can be financially or, you know, a wide variety of other ways as well. You said about patients' access to ayahuasca. You know, there are some estimates that psilocybin might be available to use, maybe even on the NHS in the next few years. I think that's probably quite a generous estimate, but who knows? You know, I don't think we're going to see ayahuasca on the NHS anytime soon. But maybe we'll see it in a different way, you know, the same way that you have acupuncture clinics. So acupuncture is not recommended by the NHS, but they have their own kind of, their own board, their own regulation. And you can go to these kind of alternative medicine clinics. And maybe we'll see ayahuasca like that, where we have these clinics that are running ayahuasca, hopefully in a respectful way and working with indigenous communities as much as possible, but they have their own regulatory board. Who knows? Maybe we will see it on the NHS. I don't know.
I mean, do you worry? I mean, because I'm not well versed, obviously, on actually preparing ayahuasca, and obviously, of course, you can synthesize DMT instead. Does that seem then like maybe using DMT rather than ayahuasca might be a more, if we want to use it in the UK, say, that might be a more sustainable practice? Because I presumably you can't, I don't know if you can grow the plants here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. You can always use different plants to get similar effects to ayahuasca, but then arguably it wouldn't be ayahuasca. As far as using DMT goes, I don't know. I mean, there are studies starting up now looking at the clinical applications of DMT. There's one that's being run by an organization called Small Pharma, specifically looking at the clinical applications of DMT. And so it'll be interesting to see what the outcomes are from that. But other than kind of anecdotal evidence, I'm not really sure what that would show. I imagine that it would have benefit for sure, but I imagine it would be less, maybe less is the wrong word, different to ayahuasca.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually started my drug science life with Small Pharma, and they were just starting their DMT prep. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So do you think then, because obviously we spoke about, and obviously you had controls and things who were there, and there's a few questions about just going over who the controls were and what aspects of the retreat they were involved in and what they weren't involved in. But so do you think, with ayahuasca or even DMT and things, it's what happens when we remove the ceremony from it, and what was it like for controls, I suppose, who weren't doing it but were experiencing the retreat?
Yeah, I mean, our controls weren't doing the retreats; they were just in the hostels. But yeah, so there are a few different groups who have used ayahuasca in lab-based settings. So there's a Brazilian group who it's amazing actually. They had a control group, and they made this thick, gnarly black brew that had no psychedelics in it at all, but just really irritated your intestinal lining, so that everyone was sick. So that was a really good control. But yeah, some of the participants had really positive effects as a result of this placebo. And in fact, some of them even thought that they were drinking actual ayahuasca and having psychedelic effects. But yeah, and then there are other labs that have used, such as Jordi Riba's lab in Barcelona, who use freeze-dried ayahuasca. So that's taking all of the liquid out and making ayahuasca pellets. And they've had great results as well. They've shown great things, having either different or no ceremony. I guess there's always some kind of a ceremony, even if it's a doctor in a lab coat. That's a different form of ceremony. But I do think that it would be a kind of a slightly truncated version of the effects, and if they were working, maybe I'm slightly biased because of the research that we do, but I do think if they were working with the curandero in a setting that wasn't a hospital, those results would probably be even more pronounced.
Okay, that's really interesting. I've slightly lost it in the questions. Trying to read it and find it again, but there was just, while we mentioned the poor control group who were made to vomit without being given ayahuasca, there was a question that is unfortunate, isn't it? There was a question about the significance of purging, I think, and whether it is really just a side effect or whether in part it's necessary, but I know not everyone does actually vomit, so
yeah, I think the Shipibo would definitely say that it's really necessary. That's you're allowing all of this kind of this blocked energy, this blocked emotion out. And I know, speaking to psychologists such as Ros about this, Ros Watts, I think there's something about getting back into your body. So when you're physically, when you're purging, you're not thinking, and there's something about just being in your body, not overthinking, and so potentially it plays a psychological role as well. That being said, in some of the ayahuasca churches, so that's where they drink ayahuasca in combination with Christianity, and because they drink it in these churches in Brazil, in these big congregations, a lot of the purgative components of ayahuasca have been removed. Some people still do purge, but they don't vomit as much. Yeah, I personally think that it is an important part of it, and you can look at that through either an indigenous point of view or a psychological point of view. Either way, I think it definitely plays a role.
That's really interesting. I like that as well. It's a very extreme form of sort of mindfulness.
Yeah,
it's vomiting and you're really present. So hours of meditating.
I think just mentioning on that mindfulness thing, so I think in your talk you mentioned this mindfulness, and there's a lot of chatter. What is that? Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? I think it made me chuckle.
Yeah, I mean, it got kind of, so the increase in mindfulness with apps like Headspace, which I think they're great. I think it comes to this idea that it's kind of really easily accessible mindfulness that fits into a capitalist society that allows you to focus your mind in order to do more capitalist stuff. And so it's got that kind of idea of making a business out of mindfulness. And I guess, you know, you could think the same way about psychedelics as well, as in treat your anxiety so you can get back to work. I personally don't think that. I think it's just an interesting thing to consider. You know, where do these fit into Western society, and also just being aware of how they change. I think that, you know, yoga, like original Indian yoga, is probably really different to the kind of yummy mummies in Peckham who are doing yoga every Saturday morning. You know, it'll be a really different kind of thing. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying we need to be aware of it.
I think, yeah, it's interesting to see, you know, like an old practice being made into sort of a capitalist thing. And I think it's nice that it's very accessible and that you do have all of these apps, and a lot of them are free. And I think though that there's always that thought in the back of my head, like if something's free, then I'm probably the product. I'm probably what's being sold. So what are they actually gaining from this? You know, I think it is amazing that we're having a big change in the way that we, you know, see mental health problems and tackle them. And I think mindfulness and meditation are great, as well as psychedelics. But there's just always that pesky capitalism just niggling in the back, trying to get its way in. And just talking on that, like how do you think we can prevent that from, how can we prevent the sort of westernization of this industry?
To do with ayahuasca?
Yeah, in general, everything.
I think it comes back to working closely with the indigenous, to making sure that I think it's going to change naturally, or it already is, but working alongside the indigenous to make sure that we're approaching it in a respectful way and trying to maintain the tradition as much as possible. But again, you know, I don't have the answers to these questions. This is an ongoing thing that I think we will need to be aware of and will need to be thinking about if we're working in this field.
Mm-hmm. I think just going on from that, talking about sort of that West perception of psychedelics and ayahuasca, did you yourself have any misconceptions before, you know, going into this field? And have any of those changed? And do you think that there are any misconceptions that the general West do have that need to be changed? I know you already mentioned the sort of the history of psychedelics and how they haven't actually been around that long, but I don't know if you can elaborate on that anymore.
Yeah, sure. I think I probably slipped into the category that most of us did, thinking that ayahuasca is this ancient thing that's based around love, which I'm not saying it's not, like it is. That is one side of it, but it's also, you know, the way that it's used with a lot of the groups like Shabibos. It's, you know, it was used for warfare and for hunting, and I think it's easy to have this idea of what we would like it to be, whilst ignoring how it has been used. And again, it's not good or bad. It's interesting that we try and fit it into our cultural idea of what it should be, and perhaps ignoring what it really is.
I've got some great questions I've just spotted from here. I'm very excited about them. And now I've just lost it immediately. Where's it gone? Oh, so there's one here about, do you think we should aim for a Western adjusted ceremonial procedure? Would it make sense to have an experience that better fits your reality and cultural identity compared to having such an experience that ends up completely unrelated to your day-to-day life? So, and so that relates back to the integration process.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the most honest answer to that is I don't know. I don't. I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
throwing some big ones today.
No, that is a big one. I think there are different aspects of the ceremonial process that you can focus on that relate more to everyone's life, and I think it's okay to focus on, you know, it'd be ridiculous for us to, you know, focus on the warfare aspect and the, you know, the kind of hunting, you know, big game or whatever, if we're that, you know, it has no relation to us. Yeah, but I think at the same time it's just important to have that understanding of what it is, even if you're using it for your own purposes and bits that you relate to more.
That's really interesting. And there's also a question here, I think, about studying the kind of response using fMRI to look at it. And is that something that would be possible, or is it something that's so dependent on your environment and the ceremony and the process that that's just not going to be something we'll be able to do?
It's already been done.
There you go.
So it's been done, obviously not in a ceremony, but it's been done in a lab to look at the way that the ayahuasca is affecting different parts of the brain. And unsurprisingly, it's very, very similar to psilocybin and to LSD. So it's affecting the default mode network and stimulating your occipital cortex. So it's you're literally seeing with the eyes shut. Actually, that's the name of Jordy Reaper's paper, Seeing with the Eyes Shut, if you want to have a look at it.
That sounds great.
I think we've got another question that I think a lot of the students here would actually like an answer to. So both Anna and myself are medical students that are looking to go into this field, and I'm sure there are a lot of other people in the chat that are similar and are looking to become psychiatrists. And can you just tell us a little bit about your route to where you are now and any advice you'd have for us?
Yeah, so I took a break after F2 and was working in I got a bit disillusioned with medicine and took a break after F2, and then was working in northern Uganda with child soldiers, and that was even more taxing than F2. I was like, right, I need to have more of a break. And so I was in South America, and I met someone who was working as a curandero, who invited me to come with him to Peru to see what they were doing, and I was I was just really blown away by the effect that ayahuasca had on me, and also the people who were at this retreat center. And I was quite fortunate that at the time they were thinking about building a research center, and so I was happy to kind of switch my focus from research in Uganda to research with ayahuasca. I think my main advice would be, the thing that was putting me off it is this career suicide. And so when I did my interviews to get into the Maudsley, I didn't mention any of the research that I've been doing then for a good 2 years. And then when I was in, kind of let everyone know, obviously. So my advice would be just to go for it, and to remember that it is like it is a really promising field, but also not to get too into it and too blown away with it, because there's also this risk of glorifying psychedelics into this magic bullet, and like there is no magic bullet. It's just another interesting field that needs really good science to hopefully bring it into clinical practice.
It's interesting that you say that you almost kept it a bit of a secret when you were applying for your most recent job. I think I can relate to that completely. When I've told people that, when I've told doctors on placement that I'm helping to organise a conference, and then it's the dreaded question of, oh, what's your conference on? And then I have to give the whole spiel about psychedelics and feel as though I have to back up all my points. Anna, I don't know if you've had that same sort of experience.
No, to be honest, I bloody love it. Maybe I'm just not aware of it. People ask me, I'm like, this is what I'm doing. It's so amazing, because I talk personally about being really interested in psychiatry from, I studied neuroscience before, and I wrote my dissertation on ketamine for depression just before it became available. It was amazing. It was great timing. I feel very strongly, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but the dog has just come back and is running around like a maniac. I feel very strongly that there's a lot of unmet clinical need in psychiatry. So, but I suppose I'm surrounded by quite a nice bubble of encouraging people who feel similarly, but I haven't met too much resistance yet, I suppose.
I think another point that's probably worth mentioning is choosing where you do your psychiatric training really carefully, or where you want to do this research really carefully. And so I'm based in South London, so we have King's and everything, and then Imperial, obviously very, very good when it comes to psychedelic research, and some other places like Manchester, and then you've got like Ben Sessa and Bristol. You know, there are these hubs that you can go to where it will be recognized and it will be appreciated and it will be encouraged. But there are other universities and other parts. I don't know if I should like name names of where not to go, but there are certain places where we've tried to get ethical approval for certain studies, and just been met with so much resistance. And so yeah, I'll stick to the places of where you should go. So those universities, so like King's, Imperial, Bristol, just check and see if there's anyone doing psychedelic related stuff there. And if not, maybe you can ask the question, why not? And that it might be worth thinking about where else you could go.
I also wanted to ask a question about, so obviously a lot of the things that we end up treating with psychedelics are often based in sort of childhood trauma and things. Obviously that's something that you've looked at. Is there any way of, or is there any thought of or inkling of using psychedelics in adolescence or in younger people, or is it just something that we're very wary of because of neurodevelopment and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, so all of the trials that we do at King's and then our work in the Amazon, you know, everyone strictly has to be over the age of 18 for the reasons that you just gave. But again, I mean, and I'm not promoting this, because again, the answer is I don't know, but I do know that in the indigenous communities, Shabibos quite often give, you know, fairly young people ayahuasca. And so the curandero, the shaman who we work with, he would quite often bring his baby into the ceremony and would dip his finger in ayahuasca. So there's like a really small bit, and then just like put it in their mouth, so they would get used to it. And then quite often there'd be kind of people in there, kind of 14, 15, who would come into the ceremonies and would drink ayahuasca as well. So again, I mean, I'm not entirely sure if it would be safe and what the role would be, but maybe something to consider.
No, that's really interesting, because it's the same, I think, sort of worry that you have about you know, treating people with psychosis or family history of psychosis, and similarly like cannabis, when you're looking at the kind of big neurodevelopmental changes that happen in teenagers and things, that's the sort of the time that you worry, particularly because the endocannabinoid system's so involved with that. So it's really interesting to consider, I suppose, whether one day that's something that we might lean into, but I feel like we're probably quite a way away.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we need to
need
to show that it's
can't
like
do it on adults, so.
Depression first, but yeah.
Yeah,
I think
it
it raises a lot of ethical implications, giving a child a drug that is that strong. I think I've read somewhere that in some indigenous communities that ayahuasca ceremonies are used almost as a coming of age ceremony. I mean, I'm not too well versed on that, but I can see how in that culture it's appropriate. But I think in sort of Western culture, we would not get ethical approval for that. Definitely not. And as you guys just said, yeah, start off by treating the people that are not doing so well, and then seeing what we can do.
Ask the last couple of questions, I think, and then gently wrap up. I've just seen a few people asking what actually makes a shaman, I suppose, so, or that's a very broad term for it, but what is the process?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. So we're talking about the lack of regulation of ayahuasca and these charlatans who have appeared, and this is one of the problems, is that there's it's not like getting a PhD or like becoming a doctor where you get given, you know, a certificate. You don't do a certain amount of time, but it is quite a similar process. You know, it's a lifelong learning, and then you get kind of people who are, you know, more experienced and less experienced. But yeah, it's a good it would take the majority. You can't really train in something else, you know. It would take your adult life to do that. But shaman is an umbrella term or shaman is actually a very specific thing that's found in the mountains, but it's normally used as an umbrella term for lots of different people who work with plants. So for example, you have curanderos, vegetalismos, and they all have different focuses. So for example, vegetalismos more like herbalists. They kind of deal with different concoctions that aren't always necessarily psychotropic. Curanderos are more common in the Shipibo populations. So yeah, it's a lifelong learning, but it's quite difficult to know who actually is or who actually isn't, which is why it's so important to go with someone who has a good reputation, because most of it is done on reputation. And I guess this is another argument for the regulation of ayahuasca, so that people can have some kind of a certificate, but that, or some kind of recognition, but that in itself comes with a lot of issues as to who gets recognized and who doesn't, who calls the shots as to what is a shaman. And it's tough.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I can see that navigating moving forward, especially as obviously we're very conscious of not impressing ourselves or Western ideas and things into this process and this mix. And if it's something that a real, I'm going to say shaman, but as an umbrella term, is such a cultural thing, rather than having some kind of outsider regulation on it.
I mean, there's a really good article, if anyone's interested in this and reading more about this, and called, actually Beer's team wrote it. It's called "Will the Real Shaman Please Stand Up?" If you just Google that. And
I think I've seen that actually. I think I
it's all about this issue. But yeah, it's very tricky.
What a title. That's really good.
I think it kind of, sorry, I just wanted to jump in on there just before you go on, but I think you were talking about the whole timeline of becoming a shaman, and it's not just something you go to university and do, or you're not just taught it in a year. It's an entire lifetime spent developing these skills and understanding what it is that you need to do to be a good shaman. And I think it comes back to what you were saying before when I asked you about how do we prevent the commercialization, is that you have to work with these indigenous communities and working alongside them and not dictating what it is that they do, and not because as soon as you start to try to come up with a standard, that, as you guys said, that there's just so many difficulties. Like, where do you draw the line? How can you even come up with an exam to become a shaman? And that's just putting our whole Western sort of ideas back on it and getting involved. And I think I completely agree with you when you say that it's so important to sort of take a step back and let and to not put our own perceptions and our own views on these people. And I think that if we did do that, that would have such an impact on these ayahuasca retreats, and it would actually change the whole game continually.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question here which I think you may have touched on a bit already, but about looking at schizophrenia and whether there's anything looking at the effects of ayahuasca on patients with schizophrenia. So obviously not from our end, but in indigenous communities, because I know, for example, cannabis has been used in other societies actually to treat, or certainly the CBD rich ones, to treat things like psychosis. So is that something that you're aware of or know about?
Yeah, I mean, so there is some research going into ayahuasca for bipolar disorder. It's pretty, obviously it's not schizophrenia, but it's another psychotic decision. So yeah, that's Benjamin Mudge, who's doing research into that, and it's kind of I think it's super interesting to look at because he's collecting anecdotal evidence of people who are using ayahuasca anyway, but a lot of people, quite understandably, have raised concerns about is this going to promote the use of something that could be potentially difficult. I think that a lot of, when we talk about treating psychosis with ayahuasca, it comes down to what your perception of psychosis is. And again, from a Western lens, that would be beginning to disconnect from reality in terms of thoughts and perception. Through a Shipibo lens, it might be something else. So for example, maybe you have some kind of negative spirit or energy messing with you, or perhaps there's something else going on. So Yeah, I'm not sure. It's interesting, but I don't want to talk too much about it now, mainly because I don't know, and also because we should probably focus on things like depression first, before we begin to kind of get into these areas.
Yeah.